Yes, I will. You mean the terms weren't all defined for you last week? Well, I want to thank Scotty for teaching class. I was in, as I said, Kansas City. My son still in the process of moving from his home to another one. It's not really that far, and so I went to help him paint rooms in a new house, because we know it's a whole lot easier if there's nothing in there than if you're trying to not drip on everything. And so did that, and then started on the house he's leaving, which needs some extensive work. And so I may be going back, not for next weekend, but during the week to help him out some more. And I was worn out. My body is, 10 hours a day of doing this and bad shoulders. It's not that it's that hard, but the repetition of it all day long. And so, anyhow. Yeah. And so I understand that. And I figure if it's this way now, what's it going to be then? I know. I wasn't looking for sympathy. And so I thank him for that. And then I watched the class online later, because I went to the Blue River Church with my son on Sunday, and so I was looking, as I prepared with Scotty on this. I thought he was going to do a little something different, but I think he got overwhelmed with preparing for camp, all the things he was doing on Sunday, and da-da-da. And so he said, I'm just going to go with what I had. And so I'd ask my wife, I go, did Scotty do this or that? I said, no, I think he just used your material. I said, really? Oh, she said, yes. It had all the typos your stuff has in it. And so I saw, as I was looking online, watching it online, I actually did see a slide that, And so that was she's having a colonoscopy tomorrow, and so she's kind of preparing and more, all that, and so she was actually sleeping when I left. So that's where she's at.
Those wouldn't be so bad if they come up with some different flavors.
Well, she's doing this one where, instead of just drinking the stuff the night before, not eating the day before, she's had to not eat all these different stuff for the whole week. I go, when did they change that? That was new to me. So she's been enjoying bland, this and that and those things. And I go, wow. As long as they can have barbecue sauce, I'm okay. But anyhow. So last week, Scotty was presented the information about what was, what is the place of women, and so Bill said, you weren't here, I missed you. I said I did it so I wouldn't have to duck.
We accused you of that too.
Yeah. Huh?
We accused you of it also.
Well, it just happened to be the timing. So anyhow, and so we see that there was a lot of things that went on and had gone on in various congregations to various degrees and over time. And so we have congregations in our area that are more or less, however that is. And of course, probably along with the idea of maybe a baptism and things like that, this was something you don't breach, at least in some quarters. And so again, the purpose of this is trying to understand how these things come across, because when we hear about things like that or whatever, we often think of it from a distance, and we hear bad and want to stay away and all that, and we assume that those that are doing that are just willy-nilly going and doing it, and not following the Bible and as we'd understood it and all that kind of stuff. And really, for many, it was the study of Scripture and theological reasons why they were looking into that and coming to different conclusions that had happened. Now that doesn't mean everybody is or does or whatever, but to label those do that just carte blanche as they are this is not accurate. And so that's why it's important that we try to hear the story, the understanding, how it came about in whatever aspect of life, and so that we can help us to make better decisions. And so this is still going on. It wasn't there was wholesale change everywhere and this and that, and it's to whatever degree or so on and so forth. Congregations that often hold to this aren't as strict on it as we sometimes think, you know, and so there's probably more involvement and things like that, where it's maybe not praying up front, preaching, or something like that. There's certainly a lot of other degrees. And so just important as we look at this. And so these things were what was going on. Like Shane last week, I better turn it on. And so during the final decades of the 20th century, Churches of Christ, the leaders had undertaken to build almost 200 years before was in serious disrepair, if you will. In other words, it wasn't those foundations in which we were built on were getting challenged. And that's not all a bad thing, but it's just what was happening. And so due to the increased diversity that resulted from the changes and assumptions and commitments, and we've chronicled all that's gone on, the 1960s proved to be a watershed moment, not only for the unraveling of American society's post-World War II consensus, but also for the fragmentation of the denomination. Just as Churches of Christ had built, our denomination embraced segregation and racial status quo, as we talked about. You know, in the South, it was just accepted, those things. That we also jettisoned premillennialists and engaged or exchanged apocalypticism that have nothing to do with the world. Don't vote, don't be in government, so on and so forth, for what some have called Christian nationalism. We're going to talk more about that in our next thing, because we hear that a lot today. And so I just want to talk about that. And casting out non-institutionalists, and the foundations of primitivism began to crack. And so a number of these things caused that singularity, or at least we thought, was certainly coming apart some. The liberal movement of the 1960s, and remember, liberal often means different, of the 1960s led to critiques on the nature of the Bible. In other words, how do we view that? Is it as a legal pattern? And to the modernist assumption about objective acquisition of knowledge. In other words, how do we learn? How do we get knowledge? Is there only the way, you know, that enlightenment rational way, or is there other things that help to inform that? Beyond this burgeoning postmodernism and narrative approach to the Bible, liberation movements for the rights of historically marginalized people, including racial, ethnic groups, women, and now we see the LGBTQ has been getting into it. And Jerry Jones has been spending a lot of time and has written a book. Did it get published yet, Ken? Yeah. It did. Yeah. I know it's waiting. It's out now. Okay. And some others have, because this is a topic that has come in the forefront. And so Jerry would say to ignore this would be to great peril, and meaning in the topic. But anyhow, these developments intensified the culture war between left and right in American society, and that war influenced divisions in our fellowship also. Beyond all this, Churches of Christ also experienced stagnation and growth that resulted in an identity crisis that remains in the 21st century. So identity crisis, in other words, who we are, who are we? And so for many, they've seen those foundational understandings and things not only be challenged, but in some places crumble and even go away from what so much had been built upon, so to speak. Bill.
Comment about my comments during last week's class.
Okay.
I know, and that what have we found ourselves on? If you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed, and you will know the truth, or you will see the light. There's two different versions. That's what the foundation is.
Sure.
But I made comments last week that I did receive comments from a couple of the ladies, senior ladies in the class, when I was talking about, I feel like we have held back the women in the church, maybe more significantly than we should have. And I was reminded at that time of the scripture in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11 and 12, but rather by means of good works concerning women, as is proper for women, making a claim to godliness. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. But I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. Thank you very much, Anita.
And so, well, and that was a passage we looked at 2 weeks ago. You know, brought it up as one of the main passages that are looked at. And so there would be those that would raise questions as to what does that mean, since there are other places in the New Testament where it seems, there's prophetesses and they're doing things that seem to not quite gel with that apparently obvious understanding. And so that's kind of where that is, and it's not resolved. For some it's resolved, and for others it's not. And so just to realize that's something that's certainly been there. But as far as identity crisis, in other words, who we are, and so those foundations that were once, so clear, what do you do when those aren't as firm as they once were, and so on and so forth? And this is a very real thing. Some of us have probably very much consciously experienced and felt that and tried to work through what does it mean to be, for our fellowship, our faith, the value of it. Pardon?
If you let the Bible identify or define itself, and you go back to where God made man and woman, the key word there, I think, was authority. Because he's giving man authority over women from day one.
Sure. Well, okay, and so what does it mean, someone said, or we see it says in there, what about usurp? Women should not usurp. Well, what does that mean? In other words, take away.
Usurp.
Usurp, sorry, thank you. No wonder there's confusion.
Okay, you go to the concordance or whatever dictionary you want to.
Yeah.
That was the word that was used when the lady was discussing this with me last week. The word usurp is not in the Bible. But it does have the meaning of that to establish an authority that means it's similar to that of a dictatorship. Or I will manipulate my ability to do this or have authority over this. But the word usurp isn't in the Bible, so it's...
Well, and there's those that would say that the issue is this dictatorial, authoritarian type attitude or approach that shouldn't be. And so there's others that have looked into that. And again, our goal is not to deeply. It would be great if we can in the future, but nonetheless, because it would just take too long as we look at it. But yeah, so these are the certainly the challenges. And so we've looked at several responses to the cultural and denominational challenges of the period of the 70s to the 90s, and should not be taken as mutually exclusive responses or comprehensive of all the churches. In other words, don't think, oh, okay, I understand that, that makes sense. Well, that might not mean that that's what they were thinking or they were thinking. So it's always very complex. It's not a simple. We like simple. We like to make it simple, have a simple answer, simple solution, so that we can respond or resist or whatever to it. But it's usually not that way in things, as we've seen. Some chose to ignore the cultural challenges and signs that something might be wrong. This group continued teaching 20th century churches of Christ, our orthodoxy, those foundational understandings, even as some softened the hard style of the early years. This group resisted new ideas and practices. And so, whereas I've said many times that some of this was really intense 30 years ago, it really, though we maybe heard of it, it wasn't affecting us like it was at times other places. And so, and that would be true of many. So it wasn't all at the same time, wasn't this, wasn't that. And so it's challenging. Another group wrapped the Church of Christ message in rhetoric that appealed to a broad conservative Protestant bloc, though that retained traditional, kind of more exclusive theology. In other words, we kind of thought the same way as most of what we called the denominations, and mainly meaning Protestant, but we still kind of held on, but you don't quite have it right yet. You're missing out on a couple things. And so the second group's continued comfortableness with our more conservative American culture was notable, and for what some have called the embrace of Christian nationalism. Again, we're going to talk about that. And again, in a nutshell, Christian nationalism is the idea of equating our Christianity, our faith, the church, with the goals and the such of our country, and blending them and making them so. And so usually this is used in a very negative light when you hear it on TV and everything and so on and so forth. And I'm not necessarily advocating that or saying that it is, but we're going to touch on some of that. Another group that sometimes overlapped with the first and second groups focused on new evangelistic efforts. And some of this diverse group went to grace-oriented, more evangelical directions like the Tulsa Soul Winning Workshop. And as we said, in its last years, and this was 2013, I think it ended in 2016, they had Francis Chan in there and talking. Definitely not a Church of Christ person. And so that was kind of big at the time when that happened. But anyhow, and also evangelistic efforts in what was called the Crossroads of Boston, so on and so forth, that started there in Florida at Gainesville with Chuck Lucas, and that sectarianism. That's what I shared quite a bit about that we had been part of from college. Finally, a progressive and postmodern group seriously questioned the nature of the Bible. Not that is the Bible God's word. That isn't what that means. But just that understanding. Human knowledge and church community. This group treated the Bible more as a theological narrative than a legal code, emphasizing God's grace and Holy Spirit. And so what does that mean? Well, as we recall in last decade or so, remember what came out that was called The Story? And we did that here. Willie Smith, bought some of those and had us use that curriculum. Well, that reflects this idea, rather than a blueprint or a legal document that we must scrupulously follow, that it's a narrative or a story of people responding to God and the things of God and that relationship with God. And so it's kind of a narrative. And so that doesn't mean that you don't listen to or whatever, but a different look at it. And what about church community? And so it emphasized God's grace and the Holy Spirit, viewed the church as community in authentic relationship, and also fought for increased participation of women in worship gatherings. So this was a significant aspect. The various avenues travel to renew, reform, or resist changes from the 70s to the 90s led to fragmentation. And so the story was that, we are all united, be like us, meaning believe all the things we do, then we can be united. That narrative wasn't really accurate because there were so many different diverse approaches of things out there. And so in spite of us telling ourselves that wasn't the case. In the 21st century, the diversity increased due to the technological revolution that diffused and diversified sources of influence. Now, what does that mean? Instead of just hearing the preacher or reading our Firm Foundation or Gospel Advocate, where we're getting our spiritual sword or whatever one of the publications was reading, all of a sudden, I'm watching this guy on the internet. I'm watching this preacher say this. And he may not even be of Churches of Christ. And so all of a sudden there's diversity of thought. I know Reggie tells us that, on Sunday mornings, he may listen to 2 or 3 sermons before he comes here. And so, those are differing things, not just, Church of Christ preachers. And so because of this, instead of that narrow tunnel of information, now we're getting thoughts and ideas from others. Now, at one time, that was viewed as really bad. And others would say, wow, this is eye-opening. Look and see the good things that these people were doing. I know at one time, and maybe you felt these things too, was that I only read Church of Christ authors because they're the ones that can be trusted. And I don't want to be unduly influenced by somebody else outside. And so, and that was fairly common. And, and some of it was self-imposed because we didn't want to do something that was, would distract or whatever. And so this change in being exposed to what others were doing and saying and so forth made a huge difference. And in some cases, one saw, well, this isn't as awful and terrible as I thought. And in other cases, it was, wow, I think, wow, that's exactly what I think and what I understand. And in some cases, it might be, wow, I don't know where they're coming from. I mean, it could be the whole range. The technological revolution combined with the increasing individualization of authority and the rejection of institutional loyalty shaped the existential crisis of identity that defined our fellowship in the first 2.5 decades. So what does that mean? Well, as we discussed, there isn't brand loyalty to the degree that it once was.
That's what Jerry calls it.
Brand loyalty? Is that what he says? And so that's changed. We've seen it in our children. People have seen their children and in other things and so on and so forth. What is individualization of authority? That's the idea is I'm the one that decides what's right or not. Now, in one sense, that seems, well, but on the other sense, that's what we do. We try to study and learn and do what we can and come to those decisions. And so there's this change from kind of more of the whole group to kind of the individual. Some have called it radical individualism, meaning, and we can look beyond this and that, about what's going on, in the culture and everything, to where each person is the determiner of all. And so you got everybody doing that. Well, then how do you come together? you know, and so it's complicated, but nonetheless. And so now we want to turn to that. So we finally, after all this time, are getting up into the last 30 years. And we go, we think that's a long time, but it's not with our whole story.
I thought it took us that long.
Huh?
I thought it took us
It's
that
only
long
taken
to
30 years? Yeah. The never-ending story, right? Didn't they make a movie about that? And so where are we? Well, as we've already touched on, we've been saying now for several years, pointing these things out, that things have declined. Not just our fellowship, across the board. And so trying to understand how that happened by, at least in our story, understanding all this that has come up from behind. In a 2018 Christian Chronicle article, and so what are we talking, 8 years ago? Wait, 7 years ago. Can churches of Christ be saved? That was the question posed in that September 2018 Christian Chronicle article, telling the story of yet another congregation on the brink of closing its doors. The West Texas Church of Christ in Cress, and I have no idea, Scotty might know where that is, had dwindled to 7 members. Elmo Spelling, at 104 years old, still served communion. As hundreds of congregations like the one in Crest closed their doors in the 2010s, leaders and lay people experienced this existential crisis, this huge problem. What do I do? All that I've known. And so those that are lingering on keep doing the basic things they knew. Having worship, passing communion, so on and so forth, just clinging on. And yet, what do I do? And this is a complex thing with no simple answer, but just those feelings and struggles. Yes, Joe?
I remember when my home congregation closed its doors. Basically got down to where they didn't really have enough people to pay for the electric and
Sure.
heat and all that.
Yeah. And
But it
that,
was a good thing.
so there was down the road, right? When it closed, and then what did they do? When they sold their property, they gave a whole bunch of the money to Camp Nietes, and how they bought that adjoining piece of property and some things like that. And they have I don't know if it's Hope Ministries or something connected with them that was started up to where they're working with congregations in that, so that even though it's closing, can there still be good done with those finances of that selling and giving it to those good works. And again, that was kind of started, I don't know if it's 10, 20 years ago, but in response.
But I wasn't talking financially. It was good for my family.
It was good for your family closing?
Yes.
And why was that?
Because they went to a congregation where my dad moved from one eldership to another eldership because they made him an elder also. But it was a congregation that was a larger congregation. Even though my mom really didn't know how that would work out with my sister, but they did, and it was good.
Sure.
That they moved there.
And that's a difficult thing. Those kind of where you put your heart and time and everything for so long, and now that's but these are things that were happening, and it wasn't just with us. And so important we see that. From 1906 to the 1990s, Churches of Christ grew from 160,000 to 1.26 million. Now, we kind of addressed that some time back, where at one time we were told that it was 2 or 3 or whatever, and then there were those that were knowledgeable in those kind of number things, statistics or whatever, and that they realized that how they got to those larger numbers was kind of faulty. It was just, they kind of said, well, I think we got about this much, and then let's add 10%, and just stuff like that. So it wasn't as accurate And so they've come up with this, and I don't know enough one way or another, but nonetheless. And membership steadily declined throughout this century, our 21st. Hey, you know, we're a quarter of the way through this century already. You know, for most of us, we think, oh, that's the 20th. No, it's the 21st. A decrease of 163,000 members over 18 years. So there was a dropping, and that's a significant amount when you're the size.
Those original 160 died.
Well, it could be death, but there was also people that went elsewhere. Most existing members worshiped in small congregations. By 2016, 92% of the congregations had fewer than 250 members, and 55% average only 34. And so we are a fellowship of a lot of small congregations as a majority. There's some really big ones, but that as percentage-wise, that isn't huge. Now, observers sounded the alarm of decline since the beginning of the 21st century. Every 3 years, and I think that's because the Church of Christ, that directory, Where We Meet or whatever that book that they put out, probably happened every 3 years. Anxious leaders watched the new statistics of the Churches of Christ in the United States directory confirm their fears. Every 3 years, a spat of anxious stories examined the decline, offered responses to stop the bleeding. In 2019, Stan Greenberg and Tim Woodruff projected that membership could decline to 250,000 by 2050. And again, projection. And so the picture was grim. Now, these two guys, Stan Greenberg and Tim Woodruff, Eric and I went down to something at Oklahoma Christian a few years ago, and I remember we talked about it when we came back. And we got to listen to both of them present this information. And I think that was before COVID. But we got to hear them and listen to them. And it was pretty compelling, a lot of the things that they said. Tim, the one on the bottom, passed away last year. I didn't know that till I was looking up yesterday on some things, and he passed away. He had something. I don't remember. It wasn't cancer, but it was something. He wrote the book, The Church That Flies, and some other things like that. He used to be down in Nashville at Otter Creek and places like that. The decline in membership since 2000 had widespread effects. First and foremost, it exacerbated the identity crisis that was already acute in the 90s. In other words, we're struggling. What do we do? What do you share with people? You know, I always share with people how to get them to understand things all the way I did on not only Jesus, but issues. Because I thought that those things were important to one's salvation, the understanding on all these different particulars. So how does one deal with that? And it's challenging. And so what does one do? And then it just keeps declining. It is true that some U.S. congregations flourished and growth occurred elsewhere in the world. For example, Africa and India each had about as many adherents as the United States. And we've all heard those stories, that what we used to call the third world countries are now sending missionaries here to the United States when we were the ones that were sending our missionaries there because they see we need so much help, if you will. But the loss of members in the United States lingered as an angst-inducing, ever-present reality that influenced most reflections of Churches of Christ's character and identity in the 21st century in the United States. Now, I don't know if recently you've been reading, we've all read of these declines across the board. Now they're saying that that's kind of leveled off. Some, whoever they are. And there are especially young men are kind of going back to looking for a more robust faith, and some of that was they're going to like the Orthodox churches, like the Greek Orthodox or probably the Catholic or something, and things, at least that's what this article is referring to. And so, at least in the minds of some, that this steep decline is maybe leveling out, sort of, and probably realizing, you know, the emptiness and the things that we all know that God can satisfy. Churches of Christ are not alone. National polling organizations and sociologists of religion reported that mainline denominations experienced dramatic decline in the 21st century. Evangelicals and Catholics also experienced decline as percentages of the population. Now, I don't know if you remember in the 70s, and I've mentioned this before, and you know, my dad was one that always talked to himself in the mirror. And so my bedroom is kind of next door, so I could hear the conversations. You know what happened then? We saw that a lot of what we called the liberal denominations were having steep declines. And where were those people going? They were going to the more conservative congregations, you know, Baptists or whatever, Church of Christ, however that applies, and that it was looked at as, well, that's because you've left God and aren't believing the Bible. And so people are wanting that, and I think there is truth in that. So then when we get up into our times, what do we do when it was happening to us? You know, we're kind of over there, well, that's happened to you because of this. Well, how does one deal with that? Can't have those simple answers per se. And so, anyhow, just part of what's going on. The most staggering story related to decline was the rise of the religiously unaffiliated from the 6% of the population in 1972 to north of 25% in 2022. Whoa, that's a huge jump. Now, sociologists urge caution when evaluating these statistics because analysts did not yet know if the unaffiliated category represented inactive affiliates who feel freer to dispense with the religious label they were using before, or whether it really indicates a general move away from engagements in religious institutions. So what does that mean? That means that they're saying that part of that decline did not necessarily mean that they had lost their faith in God, that they had left God altogether, but that what they were leaving is what you would call that established religion, if you will. And so, and we've talked some about that as to why, you know, the Baptist church down there at Mid Rivers in '94 changed to Waypoint. And why isn't, they're still Baptists, but why doesn't it say Baptist out there? And so we talked about, and that's part of that feeling that institutionalized, or that structure, whatever you're going to call it, was not attractive. My nephew was baptized at Matthias's lot near Pudman Ford. That's where they're located, Matthias's lot. And it kind of makes sense when they explain what the name is.
I'd like to know where they get these names. You know.
Well, this is a biblical name.
Oh, I don't
But
one C. All the signs coming into here was one C.
yes,
Now that would be.
that is a direct reflection of this. I think, yes.
So my brother goes to a church in Brooklyn, and they have 3 different names that they have out on the internet that they use so that people are not so, you know, sometimes there's a negative connotation, right? That with the dyed-in-the-wool Church of Christ. And so I said, so you're okay? I'm not questioning it, but it's like, that's interesting to me because I think, again, people are doing that because of exactly what you're talking about, right?
Sure.
And they're trying to reach people that maybe COC couldn't reach, but then when they come and study with them, then they get a different idea.
So it becomes about the word, relationship, things like that, what they're considering authentic reasons rather than just brand name. I remember, I think I've told this before, when we left what was the Boston Movement, our group that planted the church here, and we kind of formed our own little group. I call it our therapy group for 2 years personally, and we formed our group, and then frankly, you know, as we're looking at this, there were numerous of us who say, why don't we change our name? Why do we have to have Church of Christ with it? I'm just explaining the thinking. And some of us felt kind of strongly about that. I was kind of one of them that felt, hey, what are we doing that's any, you know, this or that or different? And so Jerry Jones at the time was working really hard to try to get us some funding so that we could, because, you know, we weren't really big, and support Jim, who was a preacher there. And Jerry found some support, but if we changed the name, we weren't going to get the support. And so we didn't change the name. Now, that didn't cause, you know, but just an illustration of some of that. And so why were there some of us that thought that? Well, because of the experiences we had, we thought, can we try to, you know, let's try something a little different. Let's not be attached to just this. Because when you're in the Boston movement, all you did was put on the main line. Because they weren't this or that or whatever. So, you know, we're used to that kind of mindset. And so, and so there's a lot of things we're processing through nonetheless. But that's kind of what's at the heart of some of this, and that was 40 years ago, 35 years ago. And so this is that struggle that's going on. Regardless, a drastic rise in religiously unaffiliated individuals became a source of concern for Christians of all stripes, especially as denominations simultaneously reported the net loss in membership year after year and watched polls at the American public's decreasing confidence in institutions, including churches. And so now, one of the things that you have out there, you know, we've all heard of the mega churches. There isn't all mega churches. There's places that are focusing on house churches. And they're in this county even. And there's groups that are promoting that is a much better way for all kinds of reasons. And so that's reflecting this. That's that adapting to this. And it's in all groups. Regardless, excuse me, I just said that. Membership decline was not only the challenge to our identity in this new century, and increasing fragmentation created significant diversity within our fellowship that intensified the problem. After the 1960s, whatever consensus existed among mainstream white churches of Christ slowly eroded. Exasperated division in the 21st century, the technological revolution produced the internet and smartphones, which together with social media platforms provided every individual with immediate access to an unprecedented and often I can't even say that word, algorithms, number of voices on every possible issue. Shane.
What do you think is going to happen when AI gets a hold of Bible translation?
I haven't even taken time to consider that.
I mean, what's coming? I mean, literally what's coming with all that is
Chaos.
is beyond anything we've thought of. I mean, it's already it's already bigger than and more active. But what happens when there are quote unquote breakthroughs with translations? Because I mean, think about it now. Think about all the translations now with just people working on it.
Sure.
I mean,
In other words, we're in a time of just so many challenges with all this. And the people that always liked it nice and tidy and simple and fewer and choices and all this kind of stuff, all of a sudden now you're just bombarded. And yet those that are coming up, being raised in this time period, they, that isn't so strange to them.
Sure, sure. I think the interesting thing is, we've just seen the decline of numbers in congregations. Yet you see a flourishing number of new groups
Yeah.
developing, like the Seed. And there's a building in by us, that just a new group has moved into. It's got a new name that I've never heard before, and that's just happened in the last 2 or 3 months. So there's still religious groups popping up all over the place, even though the numbers is going down within the congregations. I think our problem as a congregation, which is the most important issue, is we're simply not evangelizing. I know I haven't been active in that arena, and I don't think very many others in the congregation have been actively seeking to bring people into the church than we were 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and so you're right, that certainly not, and that was complaints of like the Boston movement and others like that, and that was 40 years ago. But also there are those that raise the question, as I mentioned earlier, what are we evangelizing them to? In other words, is it to a certain set of understandings, as once was? Or is it, to Jesus Christ exactly? Yeah, and I'm not saying it's all either or whatever, but I'm saying those are challenges.
I think that's God's plan. I think that's the reason He wants each congregation to be autonomous. We develop our own, I don't know, function, our own values, our
Own way of doing things.
yeah, and that's what we bring people to, is our collective understanding of God's word as we work and worship together. The issues that come along, like women's role in the church,
Yeah.
is something that we as a congregation deal with that doesn't fit the church down the street or the church across town. It's ours.
Sure.
And that's where we should focus, and that's where we should bring people to it. They may not care for our function. They may find themselves more comfortable at the church down the street.
Yeah.
But the point is, we brought them in and introduced them to God as we understand God, as we understand our role in serving God.
Yes.
And we stopped worrying about what the church down the street's doing. That's their business. That's the reason they're autonomous. When we get to that point, we stop arguing over the minors and start focusing on the majors. I think we'll get back closer to what God wants us to be.
Sure. And that's how do we direct them to Christ, and not getting lost in all the
We're not
particular
bringing them to us.
exterior things. Well, that
Bringing them to us. We're bringing them to Him.
that should be what we do. We haven't always done that. So, okay, we've got to end. We're way past time. So thank you very much, and we will continue on next week.